This is part 2 of how to embroider the Immaculate Heart of Mary. In part 1, we went over preparing the hoop and the floss, and we embroidered the roses and the sword. In part 2, we will embroider the heart with a special raised edge technique that I will show you, as well as the flames in 2 colors that we will blend together. And then at the end, I will show you, once you are finished your embroidery, how to back it to protect your work and so that you can use the pouch without worrying about the embroidery at the back snagging. All of the materials needed for this embroidery can be found in my embroidery kits, which are in my shop, so I will link that in the description of this video. So once the roses and sword have been embroidered, we will move on to embroidering the heart. Now for the heart, we need 4 strands of the red floss, and so once you've cut your floss, you can separate it into 4 strands, which will leave you with 2 strands left over. Now you can use both of these to embroider the heart, because the 2 strands, you can actually fold it in half and knot both ends together, so essentially you will still have 4 layers of the floss to use. And so this is a pretty convenient way that you can use up all your floss. So here I am separating the strands. Now if you hold this up high, which I have trouble showing in the video, but if you hold it up high so that the end completely dangles, it will unravel itself. And as long as you pull nice and slowly and let it unravel, you should be able to do this without it getting tangled up. So of course here I got mine tangled but if that happens, you can easily untangle it. And you just thread it and knot it like I showed in part 1 of the video, and you will be ready to embroider. Now before we start filling in the heart, we are going to outline the heart with a simple back stitch. And the reason that I do this is twofold. So first, it helps provide a sort of a guideline for where to insert your needle, and it gives you smoother edges. And secondly, it gives you a slightly raised edge, and in my opinion this looks a little bit better. So this step is not mandatory to do, but I do think it's worth doing, and it's fairly simple and easy to do and does not take that much time, so I think it's worth it to do to make your embroidery look a little bit more finished and professional. So you can see the size of my back stitches that I am doing here. It's not too wide and it's not too narrow. When you're going around curves, if you make your stitch length too long, then it'll start to look chunky and square. So keep that in mind when you're going around the curves. You don't need to make them very tiny, but if you make them smaller, you will have a smoother curve as you're going around the heart there. When you reach the roses, since the roses stick out of the heart a little bit, you can actually skip the rose and bring your needle up just underneath the rose there. So you'll end up having a gap in your outline, which is okay because you'll actually have a gap once you're filling the heart. And so if you see it at the end, this will make sense to you. If for some reason your roses have ended up smaller and they don't go past the edge of the heart, then you can just go ahead and continue your back stitch without stopping for the heart there. So use your judgment. There is never just one way to do an embroidery. It's very personal. However, I do like to show specifically how I do it because I know some people like to know exactly what to do. Now another thing I'm showing here is a faster way you can do a back stitch. Here you're taking 2 stitches at once, so when you do the back stitch, you insert your needle at the end of the previous stitch. You insert it, but instead of pulling it through, you insert it through a little bit forward where your next stitch would be. And so you're essentially doing 2 stitches at once, and I like to do it this way because it goes faster, especially if I'm just back stitching straight lines like this that are not too complicated. So you can try that out. If that is too difficult or complicated, don't worry about it. I'm simply showing a different technique that you could try if you're ready to do so. And as you can tell, even for me, sometimes there's little snags, and if that happens, you can easily just fix it with your needle. And worst case scenario, you can undo the stitch and redo it. So I am just going to speed through the rest of this because I think you get the idea. When you get to the sword, you will have to skip it like I was showing you for the roses, so you could do that fairly easily. And then once you've finished your back stitches, you can either tie it off at the back, or since you're already up here, you can start filling it from here. Now I am tying it off here because I have such little floss left, and filling in a space like this takes quite a bit of floss. You go through it fairly quickly, and so I have decided that I will just start with a new nice long piece. So here I am knotting it off in the back, and I explained this a little bit more in part 1 as well. And I will grab my new strand, and you can see what the back of mine looks like once it's back stitched as well. So I'm just realizing that earlier I actually used the 2 strands for doing the back stitch around the heart, and now I have the 4 strands left. I think because the reason I did it this way is because I knew that the back stitch would use less floss, and if you have 2 strands folded over, obviously you have half as much of a floss length to work with, so I saved the longer 4 strand piece for filling the heart. I like to embroider with a longer piece of floss so that I don't have to keep changing it out, but it's entirely up to you. It can be trickier with a longer piece, and if you find that it is getting too tangled, you can try a shorter piece. So here I am, threaded the needle and tying the knot so that I can begin filling the heart. To fill the heart, we will use 2 different stitches, and you will see what they are in a minute. To start off, insert your needle right at the center of the heart, just behind your back stitch line. And once you've pulled that through, you are going to take your floss straight down until you reach the rose, and insert your needle slightly underneath the rose if you can. This will just help hide the edge of your floss underneath and ensure that there's no gaps in between the filling of your heart and the rose. Now, once you've done that, come back up again just behind the back stitch line, immediately beside the previous stitch that you took. So you're taking straight up and down stitches, and this is how you will fill the area. Now, when to do a satin stitch versus a long and short stitch, which are the 2 stitches we are using here, this one is called a satin stitch. It's when you start at the top and you end at the bottom of the area that you are filling. And you can do that if your area is not too long. But once you get to a longer area to fill, if you take stitches that are too long, you're going to risk them becoming loose, or things getting in between them and just not looking as neat and straight. So that's when we will switch. So for now, because this middle heart is quite close to the top of the middle rose is quite close to the top of the heart, we can use a satin stitch to start at the top and end at the rose. Now here is where I have decided is a good switching point for me to switch from satin to long short stitch, because this gap has now gotten much bigger between the top of the heart and the rose. And so now you come up the same way that you would a satin stitch, but instead of going all the way down to the rose, you only go part of the way. Here I'm going part of the way down, and this will be my shorter stitch, and the next stitch I take will be a little bit longer than this one. So essentially you're going to have alternating between a longer and a shorter stitch, and this will help the filled area look more smooth, because if you had all of your stitches kind of along a line, then you would notice a very visible sort of indent in the middle, and it just wouldn't look like a nice smooth filled out area. So that is the technique here. It doesn't matter exactly how long or how short. just somewhere along the middle of the area that you're filling, and sometimes if the area is even wider, you might actually take 3 or 4 or more layers of them. But what I'm doing right now is I'm only doing the outer stitches, and so you can see that there's a gap being left at the bottom of the space that I'm trying to fill. So there's a gap between the filled heart along the top and the roses. And that's how it should be, because then we're going to go back and fill that gap with more long and short stitches that will cover the rest of the area. You can start to see that the edges of these stitches look a little bit jagged, and that's exactly how it should look. That's what will help give it a more smooth filled space at the end. So I'm going to keep doing this until I reach a point where I think that the gap is small enough that I can switch back to a satin stitch, which again will be taking my needle straight down, and here I've reached that point, straight down right to the rose and filling that entire little gap space. And so those last few stitches at the end, I'm going to take in a satin stitch, and that will complete the sort of top edge, and then I can go back the other way. Now if you look closely, you'll see the gap between my roses and where my long and short stitches begin. So I recommend bringing your needle up through the very end of your stitch. So that's the very first stitch you can find that still has a gap to fill under it. In my case, I believe it's a long stitch. And then insert your needle just under the rose so that you cover that full area there. And then do the same. The next one is a short stitch. So the short stitches may be a little bit more difficult, especially if the long stitches are overlapping the end of it a little bit, but try to find every single long stitch and every single short stitch so that you don't end up with any gaps. And do the same, just coming up at the very end, almost through the same hole that your stitch ended in. Come up, back up through that hole, and then insert your needle all the way down to the rose. Now this gap is fairly small, so when you take your stitch, you will be able to go all the way back to the rose. When we get to the bottom of the heart later, some of those gaps you'll see are quite long, and it'll take more than 2 rounds of long and short stitches to fill those, so we will get to how you can do that later. So just continue going and filling these spaces, and if you ever notice that there's an empty space, you should just be able to stick your needle up at the beginning of any gap that you have and just make another stitch there to cover it up. So it might take a little bit of getting used to, but you'll get a feel for it, and ultimately, even if your stitches are not, perfectly straight or evenly spaced, as long as you're covering your area, chances are the individual stitches won't be noticeable when you're looking at your final work in the end. Speeding through the rest of this section here, you can see how that's coming together and all the little gaps are being closed up. So once you have finished closing up all the gaps in that section, it's time to start stitching toward the left, the same way that we began the first time. So the first few stitches, there will be a gap small enough that you can just do your satin stitch, which means coming up from the very top and going down straight to the rose. And then as you get bigger gaps, you will switch again to the long and short stitch. Now I ran out of floss on my needle here, so I'm going to knot it off at the back and get a new strand of floss, and I'll just show you how I do that. So with your needle, scoop up just a tiny piece of one of the previous nearby stitches. So I'm inserting my needle here just in one of the tiny red stitches, not all the way through the fabric, just scooping up a little bit of that stitch. and then don't pull the loop all the way. You're going to stick your needle through that loop and then pull it nice and tight. So that will create a knot, and you can do that again. One knot usually will be enough, but I like to double it up just to have that extra strength, and it will also give you some practice if you're not used to doing this. And if it is more difficult for you, it does help to leave a little bit of extra floss so that you have more room to work with. That's why I'm being very careful here, is because I have such little floss left that I'm afraid it'll slip out of my needle, which if it happens, you can just thread it through again just to make that knot. So here I'm going to snip it, and I'll grab a new piece of floss so that we can continue with our embroidery. So I've got my new piece of embroidery floss, and I've gone ahead and done some long and short stitches to fill this space, and now I'm approaching the sword. So I will show you how you can embroider around the sword to make sure that it stays intact and doesn't get covered up by your new stitches. So as you take your stitches, you will get to a point where you realize that if you take another stitch, you're going to cover up the corner of the sword. So here I am taking what is going to be my last stitch before I realize that I won't be able to take any more long and short stitches like that. So the next stitch that I take is just going to cover that tiny little gap in between the top of the heart and the top of the sword. So as you can see, the next stitch I'm inserting just underneath the sword there. That will ensure that the sword has the appearance of being on top of the heart, even though we stitched the sword first before we started filling the heart. Now I'm filling this tiny little gap in the corner in between the sword and the heart. And those stitches that you take will be quite small, so just gauge how much you think you need to do in order to completely fill the gap. I always like to do a couple of extra, even if a couple of the stitches are overlapping each other, just to make sure that I'm not leaving any visible gaps there. And then we move on to filling the area underneath the sword. So you kind of have to backtrack just a little bit, insert your needle just at the end of your sword, and continue along the line you were filling before. So this will most likely be long and short stitches again. And try to insert your needle pretty much in the same hole as the stitches end for the sword. This will ensure that you don't have any gaps of fabric showing through. You might have to play around with that to get a feel for where your needle goes in, but sometimes it's worth it just to take your time and really figure out where you want to insert your needle, and that will give you just a better judge of how to do this, and eventually over time you will get faster at it as well. And once I've done that, a couple of stitches, now the gap is small enough that I can go completely down toward into the roses again. So now my long and short stitches have turned back into satin stitches. I know it's a little hard to see because I'm covering it with my hand here. But as you can see, there's no more gap that I'm leaving now at the end of my stitches, between my stitches and the roses. Now I'm running out of floss here, and once I finish that, I would like to show you just a different way that you can tie off at the back, especially if you have less floss, which may seem like you don't have enough to actually do a full loop to knot it off. So what you want to try to do is insert it under a different stitch, but this time, because I don't have enough to actually loop that through, I'm going to cut right beside my needle. So cut the floss off right beside your needle, and then separate it into 2 and 2 strands. So I'm going to hold on to 2 strands and then pull the other 2 strands back out from underneath that stitch. So essentially you have 2 of your strands that have gone underneath a stitch and 2 that are out. And this way, if you take each side and you tie it into a knot like this, you're essentially tying a knot around a little stitch in the back there, and this will secure it nicely. So this is another way that you can do it. If it's confusing, don't worry about it, just knot it however is easy and comfortable for you. You can try to knot it off while you still have plenty of floss left, and that will make it more simple as well. And now I've got my new floss. This time I have 4 strands, and I'm only embroidering with 1 layer of it. And I've knotted it off at the end, and I'm ready to continue stitching this little gap to the left of the sword there. So I will keep going and filling that little gap just as we've done right above the sword. And once that is filled, then we just have a little bit more filling to do in the area above the roses before we move on to the bottom of the heart. Now to fill this little area, insert your needle right into the very last stitch of the long and short stitches that you've done, right through the same hole if you can, and then go ahead and insert it. Now as you can see, I have a little bit of a gap in between my 2 roses, so if that happens, that's fine. You'll just want to fill in that gap. So as you can see, I've taken my stitch actually all the way down in between those 2 roses, and that will ensure that gap gets filled, and then I'll continue it later once I'm filling the bottom half of the heart. So keep filling these long and short stitches the same way that you've done before. Always inserting it into the stitch directly above and taking it straight down. I'm going to speed up through some of this because you don't need to see every single stitch I'm taking, but I do want to show you when I get to the end how I finish off and make sure that I'm not leaving any gaps and that it's a smooth finish. So here I am, I'm a few stitches away from filling in that gap. Just taking my time, knowing where to bring my needle up and where to insert it. And here it looks like the gap is filled, but there's little corners that still have a little bit of fabric showing. So if I take this stitch straight down and pull it nice and tight, I can actually get it to sort of go underneath the edge of the rose a little bit to where it's not covering up the rose, but I still cover those gaps. And then I'm taking just an extra stitch down here to make sure that this gap here is covered. And to be honest, if I didn't take that stitch, it probably wouldn't be noticeable, but you can sort of play around to see what works for you. And now the top half of our heart is filled. So from here, we're going to move on to the bottom half. And for the bottom half, I want to show you an extra step that you can take to make it a little bit easier, because sometimes filling such a large gap, it's difficult to keep your stitches perfectly straight up and down, and then you find that once you've done your 2nd or 3rd row of long and short stitches, the crookedness really shows. So you can take a pen and some sort of ruler or card or something and draw a straight line up and down right in the middle there. It doesn't matter which pen, you could even use a marker, because this part will be completely covered and it won't show, so it doesn't have to be something that you can rub off or wash off. Now continue drawing straight vertical lines up and down, and this will serve as a guide to you, because then when you're taking a stitch, you can sort of line it up with those lines, or even if your stitch falls in between those lines, it'll still give you a good guide to make sure that you're going straight up and down with your stitches, and it'll help with things like spacing as well. So I'm just going to continue marking those lines all the way at the end before we begin stitching. For the bottom half, I like to start all the way at the left hand side. You could start on the right side or in the middle, but I just find that this way moves a little bit more smoothly. And we're going to do the same thing we did up top, where if your gap is small enough, you'll do a satin stitch, which is just one stitch that fills that goes along the entire gap that you're trying to fill. And then once that gets bigger, you're going to switch to a long and short stitch. Now stitch along the border first, and that will give you your nice smooth edge before you move toward the center, filling it in. the same way that we did up top. So here I'm taking a few satin stitches, and then my gap has gotten big enough that now I'm switching to long and short stitches here. If you've drawn in these vertical lines, remember that you can use them as a guide for your stitches. When you get to the very bottom point of your heart, a way that you can make it look nice and sharp is to insert your needle slightly below where the tip of the heart is, as you can see I'm doing here. And that'll give it a little bit of an extra point. You don't have to do that, maybe you don't like sharp points at the bottom of your hearts, but that's how you can do it if you'd like. Now I've skipped to the part where I've got the whole bottom row filled, and I've filled this little gap with satin stitches, and I'm ready to go back along with my long and short stitches. Now this will also be the same as you've done above, so I will speed through this and we'll stop at a point where the gap again becomes so big that this one layer of long and short stitches will not fill it. So here we are. I've decided that my gap is now too big to take one more stitch, and so we're going to do another layer of long and short stitches, the same way as we've done above. So generally a long stitch, you do a long stitch on top of a long stitch and a short stitch on top of a short stitch. So if you can tell what your stitches below are, that will sort of tell you what kind of stitch you can make above. But otherwise you can just do your best, as long as your stitches aren't all the same level, because that will leave a weird groove in your heart. So here I am doing that, and this should look and feel very familiar to you once you get the hang of it. And I'm speeding through this until we get to a point where the gap is small enough again that one stitch will cover the rest of that gap. So I've decided that for me it is here, and so this stitch I'm going to insert right underneath my rows here, which means that every stitch after this I will be able to fill the rest of this gap in between the roses and the heart. And once I have filled that area, I'm ready to come back to the remaining little gap in the middle here. So for this, you're going to insert your needle into the very end of your stitch along the row here, and then insert it again just underneath the rows, just like we've done previously. You should be able to fill the remainder of this section with one more row of stitches, but if for some reason you find that your gap is too large, you can do another layer of long and short stitches, so that's entirely up to you. Whatever you think is best depending on how you've turned out so far. And just remember that the most important thing is that you fill the heart. So even if you have stitches that go, diagonal or crooked, it doesn't matter in the end. It probably won't show up that much. I'm just trying to show you the technique that I use, that if you look really closely and you want it to look really nice, you can do it this way. But especially if it's your first time, don't worry too much about exactly how you are making your stitches, as long as the area is full. Here I am taking my final stitch before filling the entire heart. Now this is a really big part of the embroidery, simply because of the amount of time and patience it takes to fill an area so large. So if you've made it this far, that's very good, and you have only a little bit left to go. And the final piece of this embroidery is the flames. And for that we'll start with the orange floss, separated into 3 strands, if you can see it here. It's a little bit difficult to see because my lighting has changed. And I've gone ahead and knotted that at one end So I'm working with 3 layers, 3 strands of floss. So to begin, we're going to outline, just like we did with the heart, the entire outline of the flame with a back stitch. And you can start on either side of this. I like to start on the right side because I like to start filling it from the left for some reason, but it really doesn't matter. So I go all the way around with my back stitch. I'm not going to show you the whole thing because we've done this before, but I do want to show you another trick similar to the one below where we drew the vertical lines on the heart to guide the stitches, except for the flame, instead of stitching it up and down, I like to stitch it on a diagonal toward the center, and this gives it a better effect of fire radiating right from the center, which is right from the center of the heart. So I think that looks nice and has some good symbolism there, and I don't even use a ruler here. You can if you want, but just some general guidelines just to keep your stitches going sort of in the same direction would be helpful. And again, you can do that with whatever pen or marker you'd like, because as you saw below, the whole thing gets covered up. Maybe just not something that if it gets wet, because we are going to iron and use some water at the end, so just not anything that if it gets wet will soak or bleed through the fabric and the floss. And I only really like to do 4 or so lines going to the 4 different tips, if you'd call them, of the flame. And my fabric is not as good here as the one that's included in the embroidery kit, so you shouldn't have as difficult of a time as I did drawing those lines. So that will serve us as a guide, and as you did with the heart, you're going to start on one end, inserting your needle just behind the back stitch outline, and then bring it toward the center. Now, since the orange is going to be the outside layer of the flame and we're going to use yellow for the inside, you don't have to go all the way to the center, but go well over half, go almost all the way there. The reason for this is that we're going to do some overlapping later that will make the flame look a little bit more natural. So that's just a simple blending technique that I like to use. I'm not an artist or anything. It's just what I found is easy, but also looks very good. So as you can see, I'm taking my stitches diagonal as best as I can. And you can do a little bit of a long and short thing here too, so that you don't have one uniform groove going around. The uneven stitches will help a lot with the blending as well. So speeding through this a little bit, I want to stop and show you how to get nice and pointy peaks for each of the little peaks of the flames here. And what you can do is the same thing that I showed you at the bottom of the heart, is insert your needle a little bit above where the actual point is on that peak, and that will give you a sharper peak at the top. Now go around the rest of the outline of the flame in the same way, keeping your stitches angled toward the center as much as you can. And as you can see, it's a little bit fast here, but you can see that my stitches are, especially as I go around that top part, they're all facing toward the center, and you can see the sort of effect that that gives there. You can also see that they're sort of long and short, uneven stitches, and if yours looks like that, then that's perfect. So now I'm taking my last couple of stitches of the orange outline here, making sure that all of my gaps are covered. And this completes the orange part of the flame. And now we're ready to switch to the yellow to fill in the last little bit in the center. So I'll tie off at the back, switch to my yellow floss, and we'll begin the center of the flame. I'm starting with my needle right at the bottom center, right almost in the same hole as that center stitch of the heart, and then I'm going to go out from there, almost like the rays of a sun. I find that easier when I'm doing blending, but you can do it by starting in the middle of the orange and then move toward the center. Really whatever works best for you. And this is what I do. I start it right at the center there, and then I overlap the orange a little bit so that it looks sort of blended. And you don't need to make these stitches too close together. You just need enough to cover that little gap there. And the more uneven these yellow stitches are, actually, I find the better and more natural that the fire will look. So I'm just trying to keep at the same angle as the orange stitches. So again, to give that effect of radiating from the center. And I'm just sort of choosing where I want to go from here. One thing I do so that I'm not taking all of my stitches starting right at the beginning of, right at the same center little hole, because then you'll get very bulky. I start my needle slightly off, so you know, one stitch will be right at the center, one stitch will be right slightly above. So you can play around with that a little bit, because if you insert your needle in the same hole over and over again, you will stretch out the fabric and get a lot of bulk there. So it helps to insert your needle slightly to the right or left or slightly above. That won't be noticeable. If you look closely, you'll see that I'm doing that here. And it'll still give you the same effect of your stitches essentially starting at the same point. So you can see this fire is coming together, starting to look like it has that yellow center. And if it looks too chunky in terms of the yellow immediately switching to orange, you can take a few extra stitches and try to blend that in a little bit more. Now if it does look chunky, it's not the end of the world, and I think it looks fine like that too. I'm just trying to show you something that you can get a little bit of extra practice on, because it's not, you know, and this is not something that a beginner embroiderer would necessarily do, but in case you're thinking to work on something a little bit extra, I think it's one that you absolutely could work on. That just takes a little bit of practice and trial and error and getting a feel for it. Now I want to show you one example of what I mean when I say you can go back and take extra stitches. So here I've finished my yellow, but I'm coming up again in the middle of the orange in this one spot here, because I think it could use a little bit more yellow to add some balance to it. And you can do that throughout the flame. Obviously if you do it too much, you might have too much yellow, but I'm stopping when I think that looks good to me. And now our embroidery part is complete. And the last thing I will show you how to do is to finish it off and do the backing on your work. And so to take your hoop off, just loosen the screw at the top and gently remove the outer layer of the hoop, and then remove the underside of the hoop as well. And you're going to turn your work inside out for now. So as you can see, this is what mine looks like. I have one floss that's a little bit long here. I guess I didn't pull it through, but that's okay, because if you have things like that, the backing will cover it and protect it so that it doesn't snag as you go to use your pouch. Especially if, for example, you're keeping a rosary in it that has metal parts that might get in between the floss and snag at it. So turn your pouch inside out and flatten it as much as you can. And then we're going to need a towel. I'm just ironing a little bit here to get the wrinkles out. That's normal from having a hoop in it for so long. Now we're going to need a towel and then a thinner washcloth or pressing cloth. I think I just use a little hand towel for that. and I've got this on my little ironing board. If you don't have an ironing board, you can just layer towels and bed sheets to protect whatever surface you're working on. I've just got a wooden table here. So here's my towel folded up into 4 layers, and the reason I put the towel is because this embroidery has the roses especially that are raised. The towel will protect the roses from getting too flat. Now this is my backing. It's included with the embroidery kits. You want to find the side that's rough. So one side is going to be smooth and the other side is rough. The rough side, which also has little tiny circles, the rough side is the side that has the glue on it. So that's the side that you want sticking to your embroidery. And the side that's smooth will be the side that's on the top. So I've identified my rough side, and I'm just placing this, centering it on my embroidery. And then with an iron, we're going to press just in a few spots on the outside. Don't move it around too much, just press slightly just to get it sort of stuck on there a little bit, enough to hold it in place while we do the actual pressing. This will just keep it not from shifting because we're going to cover it now with a cloth, and this is just a little hand towel, and you will want to dampen it a little bit. So I already did that. I have it damp and I squeezed out the extra water, and then with the iron on medium heat you're going to just press down on it and apply a fair amount of tension there, or pressure I should say, and just count slowly to 15 before you lift your iron. It's important you don't move your iron around so that you don't accidentally shift the embroidery. And then lift it up and just check the edges to make sure it's stuck on there well. If it's not, you can go back and press with your iron again. And since it's gotten that moisture already from the cloth, you don't need the cloth again. This time you can just simply press with the iron and hold it another 10 or 15 seconds, or as long as you think you need to. Just go back and check. Your goal is for the very edges to be completely sealed so that it doesn't peel off as you're using it. So here I find that that is good enough for me. And you can tell that it's nice and smooth, it's well stuck on there. And that is what the backing will look like on the inside. So then you're ready to turn your pouch right side out, and your embroidery is complete. You can sort of press in along the edges from the inside to make it, to bring out that nice roundness. And if you need to give it another little iron, you can do that. But there you have it. So your embroidery is complete and your work is backed. And thank you very much for anyone who actually got through this whole video. I hope that even if you watched parts of it, it helped you out a little bit and gave you some tips and some new things to try with your embroidery. I'm sorry that it took me so long to put this together. I think my future videos I will do probably on Instagram as a live or another sort of format, because it just takes me too long to do the editing and it's not what I'm good at. But I do want to provide the video as a way for those who are more visual learners. If you'd like to purchase an embroidery kit, I'll include the link to my shop on the screen here as well as in the description. And I do plan to have new designs coming out. I have a design for the Sacred Heart that's already complete and should be coming out within the next few days. And as always, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me.